Hi, everyone. Good afternoon. I'm Maria Marshall. I am the director of the North Central Regional Center for Rural Development. You are at the webinar on guiding the work of a changing and diverse field, the updated community development principles of practice. And when we change who's doing the slides, I will introduce our three speakers. Our next webinar, which will be January 24th, from 1 to 2, will be on data from the North Central region. We'll hear about the Ohio Farm Poll and remind you of the NCR Stat database. And we've got a few other databases coming in 2024 as well, so that'll be exciting for us to mention that to you. I will stop sharing. And as our speakers are putting their slides together, I will introduce them. Just a reminder that our webinars are recorded. You'll find that on our YouTube channel with slides and all that good stuff. So our speakers are Margaret Stout, Professor of Public Administration, West Virginia University. Margaret Stout is a professor of public administration, West Virginia University. Prior to entering the academy, she enjoyed a career in community development spanning over 20 years. Celina Tchida, Ph.D. candidate, Arizona State University. Celina is a racial justice activist, organizer, and community development Ph.D. candidate at Arizona State University. Their research focuses on relationships between particularly oppressed communities and institutions such as local municipalities, nonprofit practitioners, funders, colleges, and universities. And Jeanetta, Associate Dean, Department of Community Development, University of Minnesota Extension, and Vice Chair of Programs for the Community Development Society. Stephen provides leadership to the Extension Community Development Program at the University of Minnesota. And with that, I hand it over to our speakers.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Maria. Steve's been around a little bit longer than I have, but not back to 69. So he's going to get us started with the history of the principles.
Thanks, Margaret. Well, I don't go back to 1969, but I've been around for a little while. So my task is to just kind of set the context a bit for this discussion this afternoon, really around the updated principles that were the version that was just updated this past summer that Celina and Margaret really kind of provided the leadership to. So CDS, the Community Development Society, was originally launched in 1969. It was a conference, mostly academic, that was held at the University of Missouri. And there was really kind of this sense of community development was an emerging field. They were trying to get some sense of what it meant to be a part of that and to kind of build a network of people interested in how communities develop themselves. And so originally it was almost all academic and extension. And over the course of the first 20 years, it grew quite a bit. In that second decade, they averaged between 700 and 900 members. And it was getting more diverse. A lot of community development practitioners and some international, primarily from North America, like in Canada. And there was kind of looking at, well, how do we talk about what we do together? Because you can practice community development and be interested in healthcare. You could be interested in the land use planning. You could be interested in agriculture. You could be interested in a lot of different things. And what kind of connects us together. And one of the things that came up about 2 years before they adopted the principles was a lot of discussion around a code of ethics and really kind of, well, how do we know when somebody's doing good community development work? And what does it look like if you're working at healthcare and I'm working on food systems and somebody else is working on housing? And so this code of ethics discussion started at a conference a couple of years before in 1982, and there were some articles written about it. And originally there were 9 items that they were proposed. One is this idea of promoting democratic decision-making such that the full opportunity for open citizen participation is assured. Another is don't manipulate people or situations for personal or organizational benefit. You can kind of get a sense of the things they were worried about. discuss and reach agreement on mutual role responsibilities with clientele. Be accountable for specific recommendations made, actions taken during the process. Work with clientele to identify underlying causes of the problem or issue. As facilitators, never impose a solution upon a client. Avoid embarking upon a project likely to occurs to disadvantaged sections of a community, and actively discourage the development of a dependency relationship by helping clientele to increase their skills and confidence in the community development process. Almost sounding like a, do's and don'ts for consultants working with communities. Those were never really adopted, but they were used as a kind of a discussion point, starting point. And then in 1984, they adopted the principles. So these 9 items I just mentioned, I touched on, they're kind of mostly do's and don'ts, things that you shouldn't be working on. And then the principles of good practice following a year of dialogue were adopted at the summer meetings in 1984. And Celina, who's changing the slides?
That's me, Steve, but I'm having a hard time tracking I didn't know you were going to list those ethics, and I do apologize for that.
So the principles, and you can see them here, they reflect some of the things they discussed in the code of ethics, but they're significantly different. This idea of engaging the citizen in community development, so they can help influence decisions that affect their lives. That was the initial one, and then engaging with people and problem diagnosis, problem solving, essentially getting a sense of what is causing the issue in the community, starting from there. Helping the communities leaders understand this economic, social, political, environmental, psychological impact associated with alternative solutions to the current problems. Assist community members in designing and implementing a plan, disengaging from any effort likely to adversely affect the disadvantaged segments of the community, and then actively work to increase leadership capacity skills. They're still very technically oriented, and really kind of designed specifically to help us talk to each other about what we do. And I know as a new community developer, when I started in 1992, it was really helpful to me to get a sense of how I approached my work in ways that reflected some of these principles. And then when I'm visiting with colleagues and others that are practicing that might be doing very different things, we can still learn from each other because we can talk about how our work does these particular things. So in 1999, actually probably even 98, there was some talk about the language. Is it still relevant? To what extent are the principal rules need to be revised or looked at? And so a group about 2 years, it was a committee was formed to kind of lead that discussion, that examination. And I know the year before is for 1999 at the summer conference, I believe it was in Spokane, Washington. There was a session done during the conference itself. I think it was a meal session where they put out there the different elements and principles of the principles that they wanted people's input on. So there was a lot of discussion at that time. They took it that discussion and kind of put it together in some revised principles that were shared back with the membership. And then at the 2000 conference, it was scheduled to be on the agenda for the conference, but there was a little bit of a parliamentary coup that year because at the business meeting, it didn't show up as part of the business meeting, but at the business meeting, the agenda ended up being revised to focus almost exclusively on the principle. There were about 75 people there. And what was really interesting was you had a lot of newer people, kind of going through these revisions to the principles. And you can see how the language changed a little bit. I mean, it wasn't a revision much like the one we did this past couple of years, where it was the principles, and you'll see, are been fairly restructured. But in that case, it was really more about updating them and making them more accommodating to the changing language in the field. The movement was less about, needs assessment work, and the language was changed to more, how do we focus more on more engaged and positive language in terms of thinking about where we want to go, as opposed to addressing some of these historic issues. And so the dialogue at that time, each one of the principles was considered independently, and there were a lot of changes. And these final 5 principles were considered, and it was interesting because they thought 6 was too many, and they wanted to take it down to 5 or 4. And if you look at principle number 3, incorporating the diverse interests and cultures of the community in the community development process, and disengage from support of any applicants likely to adversely affect the disadvantaged members of the community. Those are really 2 principles, but they were put together because during the debate around that, there was a group of folks that felt really strongly we needed to keep that whole idea of disengaging from support in the principles, and then there was folks that didn't want to keep those in there. They weren't in the original revision, and so that was a compromise by adding those into that third principle. And so the principles really kind of served as really until more than 20 years in this form, until a couple years ago, Celina, Margaret, and another committee was formed to kind of take these principles and see if we can update and revise them as well.
I guess that's where I pick up.
No, that's where I pick up.
Oh, go ahead.
Yeah, thank you, Steve. So yeah, it was in 2019, I believe, that our secretary at the time, Anthony Cook, a professor of law at Georgetown, he suggested that, we need to take a look at these again. It's been another 20 years and a lot has changed. And there is a lot more pressure on fields like community development to be answering calls that are coming from justice seeking, people in the world, social change movements. And so in August of 2020, the board put together, appointed an ad hoc committee, and our purpose was to align the principles better with our contemporary concerns about social, economic, and environmental justice, to balance the professional roles with self-organized community action. So rather than focusing strictly on professional community developers, aligning a little bit more with our sister organization, IACD, the International Association for Community Development, that, really try to include community developers who are in their own communities, developing their own communities, lifting that up. Reducing overlaps across principles, while maintaining comprehensive coverage of the substantive content, right? So yeah, going ahead and splitting up that one principle that was really two. There are a lot of principles that sort of touch on similar things, and we wanted to do our best to disaggregate those, to have really distinct principles, while that is, challenging to do. Ensure many opportunities for member feedback, input, and deliberation, and ultimately make a recommendation to the CDS Board of Directors to adopt it. Can go to the next slide. I'll tell you about that process. So this process took place, started during quarantine, and we didn't have a conference in 2020. We had an online conference in 21. and another online conference in 22. It was not until this past year that we met in person again. So it was a little bit challenging to engage people. We had to get a little creative. But so that first year in 2020, we spent, I think, about 6 to 9 months as a committee drafting and redrafting some recommended principles. We brought it to the membership first at our 21 online conference. And we had, I don't know, maybe like 20 people come through and talk with us. And it was, great, but we've thought, I don't know if this is enough. So we put together a survey for folks who, didn't have the time or capacity to, to meet together at a time, but, could offer their feedback on their own. We did a second round of feedback at our 22 conference. We made sure that it was not a concurrent session, but that it was like a main session that people didn't have other things to go to instead of. Still not a whole lot of engagement, but every time we engaged new people, got new ideas for language or things that really troubled people. Our third round of feedback, we did a wordsmithing feedback station. So we had a small room. Actually, if you want to go to the next slide, we have pictures of this. So up on the wall, we had all of the principles in their current state, with pages below for folks to, write their feedback or suggest different wording. I, had to stay up late the night before the business meeting to, to incorporate those changes, put them past a couple of the other committee members who were there at the conference, so that we could bring the final set to the membership at our annual business meeting. And we had a pretty interesting, I would say, hour and a half of final deliberations with the 50 or so people who were in the room at the end of the conference. Really, I saw folks reflecting on the time that we had spent together that week, and what we had learned from our our comrades in Portland, and we had some really, really interesting conversations, really fast-paced conversations. We broke parliamentary procedure just a little bit, but we kept it tight. And the membership ratified the principles. It then was adopted by the board who were in quorum there. So I think Margaret is going to take us through our now existing principles.
Thanks so much, Celina. Yeah, I like the fact that both times, because I wasn't there in 2000, I like hearing that this is really a big deal, right? And at these annual meetings, when you're going through these final deliberations and ratification of language, people are really passionate about what this is. And the other thing that we didn't mention, or Celina didn't mention, in terms of the appointment of that ad hoc committee, one thing that I really want to lift up is that I think the board did an amazing job of intentional appointments, not proportional, intentional selection of people to ensure that there was a balance of urban and rural members, a balance around race, a balance around gender, a balance around sexual orientation. I can't remember the other criteria that they were using for appointing members of that ad hoc committee, but it was extremely broad-based. And I think the Anthony Cook, Secretary Cook's commitment to making sure that we had a firm grasp of what social justice means in community change today should be commended. And I deeply appreciate the work that he did. So I just wanted to add that little sort of background tidbit. So these aren't really in any order of principle, priority. It's just in alphabetical order. So I do want to point that out, and also note that we're going to go through these, but we'll have dialogue with you, and we can go back to any one of them as we go about that business later in this session. So the first one is co-learning, and we wanted to use these like sort of key terms to say that's what this is about. Yes, there's a lot of words behind that, but what we're really talking about is this notion of being transdisciplinary, of bringing together formal expertise with lived experience and knowledge of what's going on the ground in communities. And so reflecting together and learning together as a fundamental approach in community development. The second one is about collaboration, and this really means bridging all kinds of boundaries, right? That we segregate ourselves into boxes over. To make sure that we're moving in ways that enable those unique perspectives to stand, but are able to be bridged, or those boundaries be permeable, and that should really happen throughout all community development processes, all the way through decisions and co-creating solutions. The third, community-driven practice, has been central to the principles forever, like from the very first set. And I think that's been very important for an organization that has primarily been academic and professional members, to maintain that commitment that we put community members in the driver's seat when we do our work. It has been and remains critical in this revision process. The third, community power, I think is one of those that really got a lot of wordsmithing. I think it started out a little bit more radical in terms of the language, but the core idea that it's not just about being community driven, but that the community should have their own empowerment, that this comes from themselves, within themselves. It's not something that's given to them by practitioners and professionals. Dignity within diversity. This was another one that was really related strongly to social justice and received quite a bit of deliberation and wordsmithing. But I have to lift up our colleague Ron Hustedy, who I saw joining the webinar earlier. He, I think, offered up this original language early on in the process, and this notion of non-judgmental listening and cultural humility resonated very strongly with everyone that has worked through this process together.
Margaret, would it bother you if I interrupted just one little bit
Please.
here?
Please.
It's something that is really important to me, dear to my heart, is in our past principles, we had this it was the clause that got lumped into another principle that was something like disengage from any, or pull your support from any effort that may or may not do, yeah. And I don't think we said harm either, but this notion of like harm will be done. We are very different people coming together to do change work, right? Harm will happen. People will be hurt by something. And just acknowledging that it does happen and that it doesn't make anybody evil or bad, but we can just say, yes, this happens, and we will hold ourselves accountable when it does, was just a pretty important update for me personally.
And
Sorry, thanks.
and I think we spent a strong 30 minutes talking about the word accountability. So yeah, okay. And thank you so much, because I agree. That was one of the centerpieces of deliberation. Economic autonomy is one that really wanted to bring into this notion of communities owning their own assets, right? Of communities being able to have control over them in meaningful ways, even if it's privately owned or owned by the government or whatever, you know, things need to be, those assets need to be leveraged toward the community's own wealth building opportunities. Social justice is probably the thing that got this ball rolling. It was the primary driver between the request from Secretary Cook to the board to revisit the principles. And I would say that this is the top getter in terms of deliberative conversation. This notion of dismantling systems of oppression is very contemporary language. It's the language of social movements. It's something that professionals get very nervous about. We are part of systems of oppression in institutions, in academic institutions and in professional institutions, in government institutions, etc. So understanding what we actually mean by this notion of dismantling and being a part of that process of restructuring our institutions was a really important conversation. And I was amazed by that particular deliberation during the annual meeting. Sustainability, I believe, is the last principle. Is that true? And
I think so.
Sustainability, you know, had sort of been referenced vaguely, but it has become so central to the work of local governments and community developers at this point that we felt we should sort of put out what our understanding of sustainability is, and not to sustain our work throughout time, but instead sustainability of cultural, social, economic, and environmental indicators or characteristics in a community, and the impacts of what we do on each one of those areas of concern. So that is it. Yeah. So I know this is a lot to take in. There was a lot of I'm going to say, people who had been through the process previously were very concerned about going from 5 to 8. And the committee felt strongly that it wasn't about the number of principles. It was about what Celina described earlier, of being very, very clear about the differences between the principles to make sure that nothing gets lost in the weeds of a big long string of ideas that are somewhat related. So it is a little bit more unwieldy. Our solution or our answer to that unwieldiness of having 8 was adding these core terms or core words, key drivers, so that people really got it's co-learning, collaboration, community-driven practice, community power, dignity within diversity, economic autonomy, social justice, and sustainability.
You could memorize that number of words if you needed to.
That's a lot too, but it's not as difficult. So what we were hoping to do during, you know, this sort of questions and answer and discussion is go, you know, kind of put some things out there for you, and also take whatever is available in your minds that you want to put forward. I think using the little the Zoom raise your hand kind of thing is really helpful to that process. And I have to lean on Celina and Steve because I'm sharing screen. I cannot see the questions that we created. So I'm gonna ask you guys to please help with that as we go along. But I'll be happy to facilitate and call on people as they raise their hands.
So Margaret, could you put it back on the list of principles themselves?
Yes, I can. Any initial reactions, comments, thoughts? Are there any CDS members that might get us rolling. Mike, thank you so much.
I just want to commend everyone involved. I was not in Portland. I was at some of the virtual meetings and the meetings before, and this has been a multi-year process and has not been without a lot of discussion. I don't want to say controversy. I don't want to say, put it negatively, but it's taken a lot of deliberation, a lot of compromise, a lot of really boiling this down to the essence where it is. One good thing about this set of principles is they are universal. In that, if you notice something when they talked about the first revision around 2000 or slightly before, or I'm sorry, yeah, but the first revision was a concern that was becoming too ethnocentric as far as did it really fit other places than the United States, North America. These fit anywhere. They deal with things that are coming up and current activities. They are very good. And I like the fact that what Celina pointed about acknowledging harm. I think if I recall, the whole reason it was in there originally was to prevent someone from, it gave you cover if you needed to pull out because you were being used by a client. But what it didn't anticipate though is that sometimes you go in places and they're going to, even though you're working for consensus, you're working to build things up, there are going to be some people who feel like they are hurt by the process because change, not everyone handles it well. So just acknowledging that, no, not that there's going to be some disruption and owning it is a very positive step as well. So I think, I mean, these are fantastic. And I really think that they help move what we all do forward in a way that brings everyone along, and and also it builds upon it and should give us, but when they sit down in 2050 to look at these, they'll have had a good model to work with.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Mike. Any other CDS folk? Bo, thank you. You're muted. You're muted.
Good afternoon, everybody. First of all, thank you to my colleagues. I'm a treasurer of the Community Development Society, so I obviously care very deeply about these principles. I do want to say that, I've had a whole history of involvement in community development as an extension specialist or administrator, trying to help lead the community development program at Purdue. But anyway, the bottom line is that this may make some extension people a little bit nervous, but the reality, we do this. This is what we do. We may not call it exactly all this, but again, keep in mind that the Community Development Society is a very diverse society. It includes not only our people in land-grant universities, our researchers, our extension people, but also includes a larger array of people in the nonprofit community, those who are local government officials. So as you read these, think not only about extension or your research in land-grant universities or universities in general, think about the broader array of members that the Community Development Society currently has and how we really need to be not necessarily accommodating, but sensitive to the kinds of challenges that they're facing, that they're pursuing in their own work. So hopefully this is I think I find this, all of us in extension, whether we like it or not, we were really trying to bring about social change. We were trying to really take those who are limiting the capacity of people who are oppressed, and we've been trying to even the playing fields, essentially. So I think all this stuff really applies even to those of us who've been have a history of working within the land-grant university environment, either as researchers, extension, or even the teaching faculty. So hopefully you really like the work that's been done. I'm really thrilled by it.
There's a couple questions in the chat. One is,
Can I just say thank you quickly to Bo for that, because I think that differentiating CDS from NACDEP is super important. I mean, in this crowd, we're being hosted by an extension center, and it is a little bit difficult sometimes for CDS members who are part of extension to recognize that sort of broader view, and especially concerns of very urban spaces, because that's not the traditional venue but it's not an unknown venue for extension. So I really want to appreciate and lift up what Bo has shared. It's very important to me as more of an urban person, even though I'm at a land grant. Steve, thanks for letting me respond to that quickly.
So one comment was, we've mentioned having a lot of conversation about accountability. Can you expand on that for us? Celina, I guess that might be you.
I'm wondering if Margaret has a strong memory of our conversation around accountability.
Oh,
I mean, I could
that's from
talk about
Trisha?
accountability, but I don't remember
from
the
Trisha?
conversation.
I'm sorry, I just had to open up the chat because I can't hear Steve very well. So really what I recall most strongly from the members was a fear that we would have to take responsibility for things, you know, that aren't on our plate, so to speak. Or to, you know, what does that mean? If I am part of an institution that is, you know, I'll just use myself as an example, but this is kind of the vibe that I was getting. I'm a white, you know, woman working for a predominantly white institution. And there have been times when I have gone in and worked in predominantly Black neighborhoods with my graduate students. And just the very presence of us as white folk working in this Black community can cause harm in and of itself, period. It's nothing we are doing that is tied to an actual action. It's tied to those dynamics, those power dynamics in our society. And so we have to do things. We have to say that's probably happening here. I'm going to accept responsibility for that. And I'm going to do what I think I can do to acknowledge trauma and acknowledge, take on trauma-informed practice. And that was kind of the conversation that went on. But I remember Bo being a part of that, that deliberation in particular. Celina, is that capturing sort of the concerns that you were hearing?
Yeah, I think so. I think, you know, to your point about fearing having to take responsibility for things outside of our control. You know, it's thinking about what it is that you do have control over, that you can change or that you can show up for. And also how you can show up for people that you're working with who have been harmed by forces outside of your control. You know, really setting your ego aside, you know, to say, yes, maybe that wasn't my academic institution. Maybe it was the city municipality that came down in such a way that shut down the project that we were trying to do, right? You know, but I probably could have done more. I probably could have leveraged more people within my institution to put pressure, right? You know, acknowledging those kinds of things, and figuring out like how we're going to like learn from them in our future work, I think is a big part of that.
Yeah, I was just
Um,
that accountability, I think is going to look different depending on the context in which we're working. And a lot of what we do with these principles is talk about our work and use the principles kind of as a guide for how we do that. And, you know, kind of fleshing out accountability, I think, would be part of those kinds of discussions in terms of what does that look like. And the old principles, it was about where is the line in the sand in which you'll just disengage if somebody crosses it, and that was really inadequate in terms of thinking about what are those situations where you really need to stay engaged, and what does that look like? And so I think the whole idea of accountability is it should be more robust in terms of thinking about what does it look like to be accountable for our work in the communities that we're working with.
And there's different ways to be accountable given the context. Definitely. Should we go to Ron's comment before calling on Rick?
Sure. I'll go ahead and read it. There's over 100 community development related degree programs in the US and Canada. Have any of them embraced these principles? Could these principles unite our multifaceted field that often seem divided? Can anyone in the training address these questions?
I can definitely say that we haven't, we've just begun that outreach, and Ron, you know that you're part of the membership committee who's doing it. But I think that your point that these principles could and probably should be put out there, both to our sister professional organizations, which is what we're doing right now with, a group that's more on the extension, sort of NACD up side of things. But also through academic programs and through sister organizations that are much more community-based, and rather than academic and practitioner-based. So I think that those are really good next steps, and feedback that should go to the board of directors, in terms of how to promote the principles going forward. And I would really encourage you to make that recommendation or request to the board.
Yeah, I also want to acknowledge there's a little bit of a discussion going on. Rani Bhattacharya responded saying that Steve and she had brought this to UMN Extension, who were a little intimidated by the social justice element, that instead their departmental leadership team have sort of taken on the sentiments of these revisions, but outside of their department, they've struggled to get sort of buy-in, which is interesting.
Yeah,
Well, these are interesting times around DEI in general. So Ronnie, do you want to add something to that
I
summary?
did want to add that I think the discussion around social justice with DEI stems from the fact of for a long time, at least in extension, we were trained to be apolitical.
Yes.
And I think a lot of the older colleagues of mine, or the people that are maybe now moved up into administration who used to be on the front line, are still of that apolitical belief. And so trying to instill with them like a sense of social justice, or like to seek out social justice initiatives, is something that makes them very uncomfortable. Like you said before, like dealing with something that you're not very well versed in, or very exposed to, or very understanding of, it makes you uncomfortable, so you just rather not do it. I think that's what is happening. And we are experiencing a significant transition within the University of Minnesota College of Extension in our staffing. So some of those people are going away and retiring, and new people are coming on with a social justice expectation. So I think eventually we'll get there, but it's just it's a process in the making.
Mm-hmm. And I would say, coming from an allied field of public administration, that same level of discomfort and that same dynamic is found. It's found in professionalized fields that serve the public, right? And so that's public administration, it's social work, it's community development. Some areas seem more apt to embrace it. But anytime that you're in a scenario where you're especially dependent on public funds, and I know how extension rolls, you got to keep your county people happy, right? And that's, county commissions and state legislators and, all of that. So, this is difficult work. And so when we speak to this notion of dismantling systems of oppression, we are fully in them. And that's hard work to do when that is the source of our wages, for example, or the funding for the projects that we hold dearly. So, Ronnie, I'm so glad that you are focusing in on the challenge that transformation requires. I mean, I think we are in a historical moment, and the committee felt that we were in a historical moment, and the board felt that way, and the membership upheld that, right? That we just have to steel ourselves for the fact that this is the work.
So Rick Morton, you have a question or a comment?
Yes, I do. I'm trying to get my camera to work. And there's this little thing that's popping up that says they don't detect my camera. So I'll just do it without my presence, my video presence. So I just like to, I was going to bring this up, and Margaret and Randy talked about this quite nicely, ratify this concept that the principles are actually or originally focused on the practitioner, the agent, the change agent. And there's still many of us out there doing the same thing that we did 20, 50 years ago, but in different ways. And the notion that these principles are addressed to us as guidance, as principles that we need to the best of our ability, assimilate into our practice and our being even, is good. But I think, as Celina and others have brought forth the idea that we're trying to bring these up to date, to our present situations and social environments. And I think it's what's been said by Margaret, particularly, and Randy, is that it's incumbent upon us to use these as teaching tools, these principles as teaching tools as well, and to engage them with the people that we're working with, to inform, as where is that Thomas Jefferson thing, inform our discretion, to inform our understanding and knowledge about how the world works, and to make that part of the teaching elements that we're trying to pass on as we engage people that not only engage with us, but also as we teach and educate on processes that make good communities. So I'm not surprised that we have these reactions from people that feel uncomfortable. That's beginning to happen every day. Actually, I see this in the news quite frequently, the aspect of people feeling uncomfortable with being confronted with things that they need to investigate and to consider as part of the change process. So I'll leave it at that, but I think it's really important that it's just not only for us, the practitioner, but also for the community, the greater community that we're working with.
I really appreciate that, Rick, because we were trying to reorient the principles so that they were about the practice of community development, whether you were a person working in your own neighborhood or a practitioner working there as an institutional representative. Celina, did you have, I think you were going to pop in and say something in response to Rick?
No, I think it's great. I think, this process was really a lot about sitting with discomfort. It's something that we I think we knew as a committee when we had our draft principles to bring to folks in 2021, we knew that what we were doing, that we were pretty much demanding that people were going to sit and in the discomfort of this and figure out, what are the conversations that need to be had, what is too much, what is too far, what is not enough, and finding that middle ground. And honestly, at the end of the day, I feel a lot of pride and gratitude for, you know, particularly some of our older members. You know, Rick is one of them, Dennis Haffron, you know, people who, you know, I'll just say it out loud, like by the looks of them, you would not imagine that they'd be like, hell yeah, let's dismantle systems of oppression. But here they are saying from their years and years of experience that this is the kind of discomfort that we need to be sitting with, you know, and this is what is going to evolve us as a field. And yeah, so it's been pretty amazing, I think. So thank you.
You know, I'm put into a great memory of a conversation that I was blessed to have with Lee Carey at our 50th anniversary conference. And you know, as Steve pointed out in the history, he was the president, you know, when the initial when CDS was formed in '69, and he was basically saying, I'm so happy that you are returning to the radical roots of CDS. You know, they were social transformation change agents. and you know, this is a pattern that's happened in a lot of professionalized fields where maybe the pendulum just went a little bit too far to this, we can be apolitical, we can just be technical experts, we can, you know, forget about all of that other stuff that's very uncomfortable and messy, and we'll just focus, you know, on our expertise. And so I felt very encouraged by that. And like I said, I do feel blessed to have had that conversation with him, because, you know, we lost him soon thereafter. So Steve, do you have any other like comparisons that you could make to that first revision process? Where those were similar kind of conversations going on about, are we pushing the boundaries too far? Are we not going far
Well,
enough?
You know, I think it's interesting because getting comfortable being uncomfortable is part of getting good at this work. And you know, there's been a push and pull within CDS forever. Is, you know, do we push the boundaries in terms of what's appropriate community development, or what we think about it, or do we focus and think about our, not so much what we're trying to accomplish, but how we're trying to accomplish it, and which is kind of what the principles have historically been focused on. And this kind of bridges both. I mean, the first 5 are pretty basically updating the 5 or 6 that we had. The last 3 are really kind of taking us in a different direction, kind of saying, look, you know, we want to see economic autonomy. We want to see social justice. We want the communities to look at what sustainability means to them. The field generally, and CDS in particular, just weren't ready to go there until recently. We talk about it at conferences and things like that, but it wasn't showing up in things like the principles or policies of the organization or any of those kinds of things.
Well, one way that I like to frame the difference between the first 5 and the last 3 is that, you know, we're very comfortable with practice. We're comfortable with the how-to, but we're not so comfortable with policy, with, you know, what is inherently political, what is inherently pushing for probably changes in a much more profound way, economically, politically, you know, socially. So I'm so pleased and proud that we have gone that far, because I don't think we can pretend that practice isn't directly tied to those political issues, you know, directly tied to policy and driven by policy. So I'm proud of CDS for getting into that pool. Can we answer any other further questions or clarifications of any of these items? Celina, Joseph put a comment in the chat you might want to respond to. I think it goes back to the, you know, sort of harm question.
Yeah, I mean, I don't think there's a question here. I mean, it's true. He says, the fact is that like some people, because of their identities, are hurt every day by injustices, and there's no comparing that to the discomfort is how I'm reading the message here. And it's absolutely true. And I think that taking on as institutional people, or as you know, privileged, like individually privileged people, every day we have an opportunity to take on risk, to take on discomfort, in order to you know, there's a word that I want to say, like diluting or diffusing risk for those who, generally speaking, carry the burden. You know, I think about like when I go out, you know, dancing or whatever these days, I wear my keffiyeh, and you know, I'm not Palestinian, but I know that, you know, Palestinian people wearing their keffiyehs out in the United States today are being attacked. And so the more people we have wearing them, even those people like myself who are not being attacked for my identity, you know, the safer it is for those who are generally carrying that burden. Maybe that makes me more uncomfortable, and I have uncomfortable interactions with people because of it. But, you know, I think, you know, acknowledging Joseph's statement here means, you know, we have an imperative to sort of take that on.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Dennis.
Yeah,
good to talk to you.
I think the word you might be thinking of is buffering. The effects. The only thing that I always worry about is, do we have the ability or the commitment to disassociate ourselves with things? Because sometimes, I've been there, sometimes the groups you get associated with shift their goals and priorities to something different than what you would want. And do we have a way of getting out from that relationship in these principles? I'm done. Go on, folks.
Oh, you know, we have in political science, there's this notion of exit, voice, and loyalty, right? And when you're confronted with those kinds of scenarios, if you're looking at these principles and you find yourself in that kind of situation, then you have to ask yourself, am I going to stay loyal to the group that is doing harm? Am I going to voice my concerns and try to change what's happening? Or do I have to just leave? Do I have to exit the situation? And I don't think those questions have ever been easy or can be made easy by any principles. It's a tough call for all of us, isn't it?
Yes.
2 minutes before we hit 4 o'clock. This has been a great discussion. Is there one last comment or question that we can put in quickly?
I love Ron's comment.
Ron, I
Just the-
want you to say that in person.
Yeah.
Yeah, essentially, Martin Luther King wrote that love, I don't have it up, power without love is reckless and abusive, and love without power is sentimental and anemic. Some of these principles could be doctrinaire and harshly implemented. So I think there's also the question of balance. I don't have a problem with the principles, but like I say, my question is, what is the role of love that somehow it balances it all out? That's a question. And I do see it practiced in CDS, but we don't often talk about it. It's considered, in our secular society, it's just, I don't know, it's just hidden, but it's practiced still.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think a lot about bell hooks, all about love. That love is not a feeling. Love is not those good feelings that you have when somebody that you like is, smiling at you or something.
Right.
Love is actually a practice that can be defined. To me, accountability is love. For me to be able to say when I have hurt you, I hear you, I see what you're saying, I'm sorry, and let me figure out how I can show up for you differently and how I can make amends for that. I mean, that's love, right? And I think those kinds of, love as practice, as showing up for and supporting the fulfillment of that other person, right? Providing conditions for that other person to become their best self. I think is woven throughout these principles. But it is like, it's so important to lift that up. I really appreciate that.
Thank you, Celina.
I would like to end on Christine Sorensen's comment about, the notion of continuing discussion of these principles and what they mean in action, etc. I want to encourage all of you who are not CDS members to join the association, join our society, because I think this is where we go next with this. When we are disseminating these and really unpacking, as Steve pointed out, unpacking the meaning of things like accountability, unpacking the meaning of love, right? So please become part of our association and engage in this work with us. Maria, do you need to stop at a certain time, or can we allow Dennis to have his last word?
We are at that point. Dennis, if you have something just very quickly, we
I
can.
just got to say, when we started out many years ago, almost all of us did it because we loved people. That's it.
Perfect way to end. That's certainly when somebody asked me, why do I do what I do? And it's because I love and I want to help people. And so that is perfect way to end. So I thank you all. This was fantastic. So great. So meaningful. Great way to end the semester. Our next webinar is January 24th, all about data in the North Central region. I look forward to seeing hopefully all the people that were in this one in the next one too. And with that, happy holidays, safe travels if you're traveling. Have a wonderful time with those you love. Bye-bye.